All right, good evening, everyone. Welcome. Welcome to the Mark Twain House Museum. My name is Mallory Howard. I'm the assistant curator here, and I'm very happy to welcome you to tonight's event. This is our first hybrid event where we have people in person and people watching at home. So very exciting that we are kicking this off. So before we get started, I'd like to take a moment to thank our Trouble Begins sponsor, the Center for Mark Twain Studies in Elmira, New York, as well as Webster Bank for their support of this lecture series. I'd also like to thank the Hartford Foundation for Public Giving and their Strategic Technology Project grants, which funded the live streaming equipment being used to broadcast this program live to our virtual audience tonight. So I will now introduce our guest of honor. So Stephen Cushman is Robert C. Taylor Professor of English at the University of Virginia, where he has taught for 40 years. He is the author of The General Civil War, What Their Memoirs Can Teach Us Today. He is also the author of Belligerent Muse, 5 Northern Writers and How They Shaped Our Understanding of the Civil War, and Bloody Promenade, Reflections on a Civil War Battle. He is also the author of 7 volumes of verse and 2 critical studies of American poetry. He served as general editor of the 4th edition of the Princeton Encyclopedia of Poetry and Poetics. He is also a fellow of the American Council of Learned Societies and a Fulbright Teaching Fellow in Greece. In 2014, he was named UVA Cavalier Distinguished Professor, and in 2015, he won a State Council of Higher Education for Virginia Outstanding Faculty Award. During the 2019-2020 year, he was the Rogers Distinguished Fellow in 19th Century American History at the Huntington Library in San Marino, California. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Stephen Cushman.
Thank you very much, Mallory. Am I okay too with volume? All right.
Perfect. So thank you so much for joining us. We are very excited to talk about your book here. And to start off, what got you interested in this particular subject?
The particular subject of the Generals Memoirs.
Yes.
When I was writing the previous book, the one you mentioned called Belligerent Muse, that had a few chapters of American writers about whom many people have written. Lincoln, there's a lot on Lincoln.
Yep.
Walt Whitman, there's a lot on Walt Whitman. Ambrose Bierce, not so much on Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain, but I wrote a chapter about the memoirs of William Tecumseh Sherman. And as I was doing that, what I realized is a lot of people read Sherman's memoirs for documentary purposes, for historical purposes, various kinds of buttressing of facts, but nobody had ever really talked about Sherman's work as self-consciously literary. And I, in the course of working on that chapter, I found out much about Sherman I had no idea. For example, one of Sherman's favorite pastimes was going to the theater.
Oh.
There's a great anecdote about Sherman and Grant going to see Hamlet in occupied Nashville, I think 1863, and Sherman became so incensed with how bad the performance was that he started becoming very loud, and Grant failed to hush him up, and they had to escort him out. Also learned that on the last day of his life, Sherman was rereading Great Expectations. And so this literariness was something I had never heard talked about, and the more I read and the more I thought, the more I learned, the more I realized that a lot of these big books by generals at the end of the 19th century, although they get read, when they do get read at all, they usually get read for documentary purposes, historical purposes, they are also works of literature, and self-consciously so by the people writing them. Varying degrees, not everybody is as self-conscious as Sherman, but some other people are as well. So I just got more and more interested in that. I would go from large book to large book, and I was quite surprised by what I found at this point.
So what would be your pitch, whether it's to a student, whether it's to a friend, a family member? Why should they care or be interested in Civil War generals' memoirs now?
That is that question I work with a lot. I get this is not hypothetical. I have to actually make this pitch a lot. I think if one does not have inherent interest in the war, and not everybody does, the pitch I would make is that Civil War generals' memoirs did to memoir writing what Civil War photography did to photography. There were certainly photographs before Civil War photography, but it was Brady and Gardner and O'Sullivan and Gibson and Barnard in the West, and then some Confederate photographers as well, who just launched it into an entirely newly massive genre. And I think that's what happened with these generals' memoirs. That, yeah, sure, there were memoirs before. Winfield Scott wrote a memoir, he published in 1864, but there were not a lot of them. And suddenly, a number of factors came together at the end of the 19th century and produced a kind of boom, a memoir boom. It happened to be on the coattails of Civil War generals' memoirs, but it could have been something else. The point is, and the pitch would be, you can't walk into a bookstore now without memoirs. Everywhere,
right.
Everyone's book about everyone's.
Everyone has something to
this
say.
Is my book about. This is my book about me, and we take it so for granted now.
Right.
And I think part of the point of this book is that story begins with these memoirs. Whether or not the people writing the memoirs now have read a word by Grant or Sherman or McLellan or Richard Taylor or Joseph E. Johnston, that furrow had been plowed.
Right.
And from 1867, 1866, right on down.
It's a pretty good pitch. I like it.
Oh, good.
I like it. So what I found really interesting, you included a comment by Stephen Crane, and he said, I wonder that some of those fellows don't tell how they felt in those scraps. They spout enough of what they did, but they're as emotionless as rocks. Why do you think that is, or why do you think he said that?
Well, I think he's responding to, he was a very young man at the time, and he was responding to the Battles and Leaders series, Civil War writers. Twain makes his own contribution with a private history of the campaign that failed. Grant certainly does, many others. And many of those writers will tell you everything you want to know about which regiments were on the left at Gettysburg and how they moved. And then there are these wonderful euphemisms that they use. And in the Wilderness, Ambrose Burnside failed to make any impression, which we think of as a social comment, right. But in fact what it means is his attack was a complete failure.
Right.
And so you get used to reading that stuff, and I'm just so impressed by Crane at that moment at the end of the 19th century saying, wait a minute, there has to be more to this. And what's odd is because of conventions upheld by Mark Twain among others, but certainly by many of the New York publishing houses, conventions of Victorian morality,
right.
There's stuff you just don't say. Well, the question is, how then do you talk about warfare in any real way if half the stuff you can't even talk about? And I think that's what Crane was onto, is there's got to be, something's missing here.
Right.
And where is it?
Right. And do you think that sort of the big three, which we'll talk about a little later on, but the big three meaning Grant, Sherman, and Sheridan, do you think that they were able to get across some of that emotion rather than just the strategy and all of that?
I think they were. People will disagree, and I hope the disagreement can be amicable. But my sense is that once you let's say Grant, once you get the hang of reading Grant, and once you realize that what passes for naturalness and simplicity and straightforwardness is actually an achieved style that he perfected over many years, I think you can begin to read between the lines and hear great emotion being conveyed. And I think, just this is a bonus, jumping ahead,
yeah.
I think that's what's going to come then in the 20th century with Hemingway, which is is the art of understatement.
Right.
And we can maybe convey more by saying less and omitting things. And that's what I started to track with a lot of these people is what are they omitting?
Right. So going back to Grant a little bit, why are his memoirs so popular today in comparison to others of that era? Is it because he's Grant and he has that big name and notoriety, or are the memoirs, in your opinion, that well done?
Both.
Okay.
All right. I think you could take your choice on that. The work of a scholar named Joan Waugh on Grant has been influential for me. She basically shows that by the time, we're now having debates about whether Grant should even be on the money anymore. When Grant left office in what would have been 1877 when the new president is inaugurated, when Grant left office, he was the most popular American in the world. And he went on a around the world tour for 2 years, was entertained everywhere around the globe. He was certainly very popular in the North, and there was a lot of popularity in the South, too, because of what was perceived as his magnanimity at Appomattox, the magnanimous way he treated Robert E. Lee and the Army of Northern Virginia. So Grant's credentials are already very, very high. Having said that, there have been popular people who can't write.
Right.
And so that's not a guarantee.
Yeah.
Celebrity's no guarantee. What then he was able to do is, under great pressure, or the pressure of severe illness and great financial pressure, he was able to write a readable, straightforward narrative in ways that are really quite astonishing. I mean, one of the things I think about Grant is you open up a chapter, let's say the campaign around Chattanooga, and he'll begin with basically a verbal aerial photograph of Chattanooga, and you're thinking, okay, right, Google Maps,
Right.
and then you realize, wait a minute, there was no aerial reconnaissance. That was him making real in words the landscape.
Right.
And he had that gift. He had the gift of being able to summarize large things and then tell anecdotes. And that back and forth quality, I think, makes the book very impressive. That said, I wasn't born yesterday. I teach young people for a living, and I know that trying to get people, I know trying to get people through a 600-700 page book is not necessarily, it can be very daunting, and so you have to be careful. But in the day in which he was writing, big books were the rule.
Right. Because
there was no TV, there's no internet. What do? You read around the fireplace, basically.
Wow. Well, we're going to get back to Grant, but what also really intrigued me, and I'm a big fan of the Civil War, I love learning about the Civil War. It was interesting to me that publishing firms published both Union and Confederate generals' memoirs, which I had never thought of that for some reason. I always knew Grant, Sherman, Sheridan, but I didn't even think about Confederate generals' memoirs. Can you talk a little bit about that, and how were they received when they were published, and how come we don't hear about them today? Is it because winners, write the histories type of thing?
Yeah, that's a good question, and one question one always has to think about. In the circles in which I move with people talking about the Civil War, the truism really is that the North won the war, but the South won memory. And that's only beginning to change now. It's only beginning to change in the last, I would say, maybe since the sesquicentennial, and certainly events of the last 10 years.
Right.
But one thing I am circling back. But one of the things that you'll see is, if there's memorabilia on sale,
Yes.
Confederate memorabilia outsells Union memorabilia hands down.
Interesting.
Paintings, so on and so on. So even though they're the losers, it actually Confederate memory has been quite powerful. Um, what I discovered, and this is just about being a bookworm, is I would read one of these. Let's say Sherman. Sherman is actually in the first wave. He's not the first one. First earliest is Jubal Anderson Early, 1866, 1867. But first edition of Sherman is 1875. And you read it, and then you look at the title page, and there's the publisher, D. Appleton and Company, one of the big houses in New York. And so I thought, okay. And then I read the memoir by his counterpart, his Confederate counterpart, Joseph Eggleston Johnston, and that was published the year before, actually 1874. And I got down to the bottom, and I looked, and published by D. Appleton and Company. And I suddenly thought, what's going on here?
Right.
Because in publishing now, certain houses, certainly in academic publishing, but I think other houses, other kinds of publishing too, you're known for having a particular list. You know, we specialize in
Yes.
Twain. Mm-hmm. We specialize in the West. We specialize in nature books. But what you suddenly realize is what you're really looking at is very savvy New York publishers working both sides of the street, because it's so freshly done. It's so freshly over, 10 years, 20 by the time Grant gets going. And certainly among white citizens, the desire for putting it behind us is so great that you are going to read the other side. And so Appleton works both sides, Scribner works both sides, Harper Brothers works both sides. There's only one house that doesn't. You know which one it is.
Yes.
Yeah.
Very intriguing. So another thing that caught my eye that I wanted you to talk a little bit about is the relationship between Sherman and Johnston, which I thought was fascinating. And you mentioned that Sherman even pens a letter advertisement for Johnston's memoirs.
Yeah.
But can you talk a little bit about the two of them?
Yes, that's a fascinating relationship, and it's not as much as known about it because all the limelight is Lee and Grant.
Right.
And Lee and Grant steals that memory show because of, it's in the Eastern Theater, it's close to Washington and Richmond, but also Appomattox is a very picturesque place, and what happens there over the course of a few days has all the heft of Greek tragedy,
Yes.
you know, the unities of time, place, and action. By contrast, Johnston's surrender to Sherman is actually a much bigger surrender. More soldiers are surrendered at that later surrender. But we don't know as much about it, at least in popular memory. One reason is because between the surrender by Lee to Grant and that of Johnston to Sherman, Lincoln is assassinated. And so that pretty much changes what everybody's thinking about. Mm-hmm. But the two men that had both been at West Point, they didn't meet there, and Sherman was not in the Mexican War. He was quite angry about that,
Right.
disappointed that he wasn't. But they started being on opposite sides as early as First Manassas Bull Run. Mm-hmm. By the time you get to the Vicksburg campaign in 1863, where Sherman is now working directly under Grant, Johnston and Sherman are going head to head. And then that becomes even more fully true, more accentuated when Johnston is in charge of the Army of Tennessee and is failing from the point of view of the Confederate authorities to slow Sherman down. How he was supposed to do that, I don't think anybody really understands. Yep. He's replaced, he comes back, and then he is finally facing Sherman in North Carolina. That's all by way of saying Sherman had been the president of what is now LSU. And he had lived in the South, and he had a pretty strong connection to the South. And he would have preferred, I think, that the war not happen. But he also understood in a very coldly calculating way that the Mississippi was too big a prize that's something that no divorce is going to agree on.
Right.
Who gets the Mississippi?
Exactly.
And that's going to be where it really gets worked out. When the war is ending, Grant has secured the surrender of Lee. Lincoln has been assassinated. Suddenly, Sherman goes from this person who was caricatured and Gone with the Wind as, the demon and the devil and everything, to actually an extravagantly and some would say excessively magnanimous person, and particularly towards Johnston. And he and Johnston are communicating back and forth about how to end this as quickly as possible, because guerrilla warfare continuing is a real possibility. And as they go back and forth, they start saying some extraordinary things to each other. Sherman says, I have absolute faith in your honor. Wow. I mean, how many people have said that to you today in any context,
right,
let alone someone who is just your enemy?
Yes.
And so that's I found that quite moving. And then what you realize is that Sherman is writing his memoirs with Johnston's in front of him. So he's able to check what Johnston says. He sometimes disagrees. And then they become, the families become friends. They exchange visits. They take dinner together. And then there is the great story about Sherman's funeral, at which Johnston is a pallbearer, an honorary pallbearer, and then this is where the myth starts to come, and that he caught a cold at Sherman's funeral, and please put on your hat, General, and I wouldn't put, if he were standing in the rain at my funeral, he wouldn't put on his hat, and then this became this great story that I think much of the country wanted.
Yeah, it seemed that happened often, of Confederate and Union soldiers coming together to be pallbearers. I mean, Grant had Confederate and Union
Yep.
generals as sort of a way to come together and heal the nation a little bit more.
Or to perform a kind of symbolic action. There's still a lot of resentment,
right,
on both sides, but certainly it's being played out publicly like that. Yeah.
So, twofold kind of question. Can you talk a little bit about, once again, the big three, Grant, Sherman, Sheridan? What do you get? What is the biggest benefit or thing you get from each of their memoirs? And do you have a favorite?
Those are tough questions. All right. I think that, I'll start with the second question. I would have to go with Grant.
Okay.
I would have
figured you would,
yeah,
but I wanted to make sure.
And Grant is just so important because among Grant's readers, for example, aside from Hemingway, were Sherwood Anderson and Gertrude Stein, and they both admired. They were talking about writing about Grant. Stein did write a very weird, eccentric Gertrude Stein essay on Grant, I think in a book called For Americans. So you feel that Grant is at the beginning of what becomes American literary modernism. He wouldn't think of himself that way. He wouldn't talk about himself that way. But Twain, in Life on the Mississippi, talks about what he calls the Sir Walter disease of Southern writing, Sir Walter Scott disease of Southern writing, and that it's romantic and flowery and all this, whereas Northern writing now is spare and lean and direct, and Grant certainly epitomized that. So I think that if I could only have one, I would take Grant. I think what you get from the others, the Sherman one is interesting for not only his literariness. Sherman liked to, he would say, I'm twice as smart as Grant, but he beats me every time because he's got something that Sherman knew that he was the best number two there was. He didn't have number one in him the way Grant did. Grant knew how to handle Sherman. He knew how to handle Sheridan too. What I get from Sherman is really helping to establish the genre. That, his come out 10 years before Grant, and Sherman knew that he wanted to write a book. He had that in him. Grant would rather have had tar poured up his nose than write a book. He did not want to write a book. He didn't think of himself as a writer. If he hadn't lost all his money in a Wall Street swindle, he would never have written the book. And so there is a sort of attractiveness about Grant. You know, we like unwilling.
Yes.
You know, those are the people you want in charge, people who don't want to be in charge. And so, but Sherman really helped to sort of break the path. And there are things that Sherman does that Grant doesn't have to do. For example, in 1880, which falls between the two memoirs, the government starts publishing all the official records. So, I mean, that's now 120 volumes, I think, and both the Confederate and the Union sides. When Grant was writing, he could look at that, or a lot of that had been published, so he could draw on that. Sherman actually has to include a lot of the primary documents, and that can make for, especially in a 19th century book where they're set in little type, that can make for some heavy going. But I still have a real belief in the value of the Sherman. Sheridan's really interesting because by the time Sheridan's memoirs come along in 1888, the Civil War market has peaked. Mm-hmm. And there's some very interesting correspondence between Twain and his assistant, in which basically the guy's saying, I thought we could just go out and do with Sheridan what we did with Grant and have another blockbuster, but it turns out we're going to have a really hard time selling even a fifth of what Grant was able to sell. Sheridan, the reason I like reading Sheridan's memoirs is Sheridan was just a can-do guy. So Twain came along and said, how about some memoirs? And Sheridan went, okay, let me look at Grant's. And then he looks at Grant's, and they're titled the same, Personal Memoirs of U.S. Grant, Personal Memoirs of P.H. Sheridan. And Sheridan just cranked it out. And what I find winning about Sheridan's memoirs is that he owns up repeatedly to his insubordination, and he admits that he was a tough guy to handle, and that's very disarming and very winning, and it makes for good reading. That's probably the one that gets read the least of the big three.
I was about to say,
because the other two are in the Library of America, but Sheridan's not in the Library of America.
Well, I want to read Sheridan.
I think you would be quite interested in it.
We owe him that.
Yeah.
So, now, and you talked a little bit about this already, but the differences in the three, or in general for these memoirs, how did they go about preparing to put them together? We know that Grant needed a lot of help, and for those of you who don't know, Grant was dying of throat cancer and trying to finish these memoirs in time to help support his family after his death. So he had help, but that's a lot to go through, both emotion, strategy, trying to remember various battles and names and soldiers. I mean, were their methods pretty much the same? Do they differ?
No, I think it's a really good question. When during the war, any general of that stature, of that level, would have had clerks, because there was so much paperwork.
Right.
You're not doing this. You're not pushing.
You can't just pull up
You
a
can't
Word
copy
document.
and paste and all that.
Yeah.
So all the returns, all the stats, all the record keeping, all the logistics, all the reports. I mean, that's what makes these 120 volumes of the official records so huge, is that after every report, every officer writes a report about. After every battle, every officer writes a report about it. So there's a lot of paper, a lot of paperwork. And so, for example, Sherman, I was able to look at the handwritten copies of Sherman's manuscript. You can see Sherman's scrawl, which is nigh unreadable. and then suddenly you're looking at a copy that's perfect. And you realize, oh, that was a clerk. That was one of his people doing the writing. And so what would happen is all these generals would have their former staff people not only writing, helping, but also you could write your counterpart. Sherman could, well, it didn't happen in Sherman's case, but other generals, you could write the other side and say, would you send me your reports? What do you remember about so-and-so? You also had all your subordinates. Right. You could say, you were under me at the Battle of Gettysburg. What do you remember? Do you have all that? So there was a big effort behind any one of these to produce it. How they actually were written varied from writer to writer. I mean, at least three of them. We haven't talked about the Confederate Lieutenant General Richard Taylor, son of Zachary Taylor, but he died soon after he published his. Grant died soon after he published his. Sheridan died soon after he published his. I don't want to say that writing kills you, but there was a sort of they were working against a real deadline, right? They were really pushing to get through, and so that would tend to, I think, color how they worked as well.
It's funny you mentioned that. I was going to ask you if there was a curse.
Yeah,
because as I was reading your book,
yeah,
almost every single one.
Well, McLellan was already dead.
Right.
McLellan's
they were either dead
yeah.
or on their way out.
Yeah.
Or shortly thereafter.
Yeah.
It was just and they're all like 50s.
Yep.
Younger.
Young. Yeah. 63.
Very strange.
Yeah. The one who lives long enough to do a second edition is Sherman. And the way in which he changes it is interesting. He goes from just the war, and then he bookends it with his life, basically, right, before the war and after the war. But none of the others lived long enough to be able to do that. And McClellan's posthumous. The other writers in another writer in the series that Twain published was Custer.
Right.
And we looked at that today.
Yes.
Custer's widow, Elizabeth Libby, who is the one who pens that book. So it's very interesting about, you don't sort of just do, my sense is they didn't just do this at their leisure after they retired because
yes,
they needed to fill their days. It was usually much more urgent.
And like you said, taking advantage of the popularity and people wanting to know and get these opinions, these firsthand accounts of what it was like in battle. I'm sure that also added to it.
Yeah, I mean, one thing that a lot of people don't realize is that Sheridan was being discussed as a presidential candidate, but then he died. So I mean, the popularity is on many fronts.
Right. Now you mentioned him. I haven't talked about him yet, but Richard Taylor, who was a Confederate general. I was intrigued by him because it seemed like his opinions changed a little bit based on what he knew of others. So, for example, we know that Grant was a big admirer of his father, who was President Zachary Taylor, that he fought with him in the Mexican War. And so he seemed to attribute the brutality of war with Sheridan rather than Grant.
Right.
And so it's interesting that he has that opinion and he can say that in his memoirs, and he's just doing that based off of his own.
Yeah, Taylor is a very interesting person. Same publisher as Johnston and Sherman and Jefferson Davis. He was, of all of them, including Sherman, he was the most aggressively literary. He was the one who prided himself on his education, his culture. People would say that he's one of those conversationalists who is wonderful to talk to and listen to, but also is always ready to make the allusion to some literary work that you don't know, and then he looks at you to see if he, and so there was a sort of intimidation factor with him as well. What's interesting about him, one of the things is that he's the only one of the ones that I wrote about who didn't go to West Point and was not a professional soldier. Richard Taylor, like Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain, like Thomas Wentworth Higginson, who in Army Life in a Black Regiment, he read his way into leadership. And he also had the example of his father in the Mexican War, but he was not a professional soldier. But he was a very smart person, and he had the gift of command. He served under Stonewall Jackson in the Valley Campaign, and then Taylor was sent to Louisiana as a lieutenant general. He a lot of people follow him in their assessments of Sherman, Sheridan, and Grant, in that, people forget what did Sherman do? Sherman marched across Georgia, made Gone with the Wind possible, burned a lot of barns,
Yep.
and changed his supply base over on the Atlantic Ocean. What did Sheridan do? Sheridan basically in 64 took the Shenandoah Valley out of operation so it couldn't supply food. He burned a lot of barns, destroyed a lot of crops. Those two people are reviled and demonized, whereas both were following orders of Grant, and Grant actually killed a lot of people.
Right.
He killed a lot of people, north and south, and yet, except for some northern papers at the time calling him Grant the Butcher, when you pull out if you are lucky enough to have a $50 bill, you pull it out and you look at him and he doesn't look like that. And so somehow his memory has been massaged a bit. And Taylor, I think, is part of that. Taylor also, Taylor, like McLellan, still had an idea about a gentleman's war, that there is a civilized way to wage war. In McClellan's case, it's a Christian gentleman. There's a Christian way to wage war. And in Taylor's case, it's a cultured way to wage war. The new apostles were Grant, Sherman, and Sheridan, who basically said the way to make war humane is to make it brief. Right. And the way to make it brief is to make it hard. Yes. And that was new gospel, and not everybody could accept that. The same logic was used by a lot of people for the dropping of the atomic bomb on Hiroshima. True. Right? If we do this, we'll save a lot of lives. Not there, but that was the logic.
As I continue asking questions, we are going to do a Q&A. So both people who are here live and those that are watching virtually, just start to get the wheels spinning if you have questions that you'd like to ask during the Q&A.
Warm up.
Exactly. So shifting gears a little bit, trying to get more into Twain and Grant a little bit. Yeah. William Dean Howells, who was a good friend of Twain's, writer in his own right, he called Grant one of the best writers he ever read, and that his style was very straightforward and simple. When you mentioned this opinion in your book, do you agree with his assessment?
I agree with his assessment, as long as I get to add an asterisk and say it didn't just happen. He wasn't born that way, right? And early letters by Grant, the young West Point cadet, and then the young lieutenant going on his way to Mexico, his letters are deeply saturated with Charles Dickens' travel writing. And he writes Julia, his fiancée, later his wife, a letter from New Orleans in the 1840s, and it sounds like something that Dickens would have written in American Notes when he came to the U.S. Long, arch, ironic, oblique, indirect, wordy. Grant was a terrible speller, and so you think, now wait a minute, how did that guy become the person that William Dean Howells praised, or the person that Sherwood Anderson and Gertrude Stein and Ernest Hemingway would admire? And the argument that I make is basically I can think of three forces working on Grant. One, I think, was his association with Lincoln. I think that Lincoln taught Grant a lot about how to withhold, how to imply, how to do more with less. The other is Twain. Yeah. I think that Grant learned a lot from Twain. We know that when Grant went to the Holy Land, he was carrying Innocents Abroad. We know that he knew Twain and read Twain, and I think that Twain taught Grant a lot about persona, about the person you want to be on the page, because we have plenty of testimony from Sherman and others that Grant liked a good time.
Yes.
But that's not the person who comes through. And Twain is very quick to point that out. There are many absences in Grant's memoirs, but one big one is drinking.
Yes.
You wouldn't know that guy ever took a drink.
Right.
And, or had actually a problem. Mm-hmm. And so I think he learned from Twain about masking, how to mask. And then I think the other very important influence on Grant is the telegraph. That the telegraph comes in, his wife is using the telegraph way before he does,
right.
and he can't even spell it because it's sort of a new technology. And but then he's suddenly under Fremont, and he's got to be, his early reports are, "Dear Sir, most," and they're long, wordy 19th century letters. But within a month, he's sending telegrams, and they have that telegraphic quality. Yes. And I think that he had such a writing load. There's that one sentence that he writes. Julian says, "Everybody else has gone to bed. Now my work begins." He stays up all night writing, night after night after night after night. When you do that, you learn to write simply, right? You just do. You learn how to do more with less. And I think that Powell's is right, but I think the mistake is, in my opinion, to say Grant was such a simple guy.
Right.
So he just
simply.
wrote the way he was, and I don't think that will stand.
That makes sense. You mentioned things being omitted from memoirs. I also was interested that he left out his presidency in his memoirs.
Yep.
And we know that his presidency was filled with controversy and corruption within his administration. It's interesting because I think Twain overlooked this when he talked about how he revered Grant. I think it was more about him as the general than him as president. And so even today, I think when people look at Grant, they think more of the general than the president.
Yeah, if Grant were a stock,
yes,
I would say, at the end of his presidency, it's high, very high, memoirs very high, and then kind of came down as you start to get the rankings of who's the best president, who's the worst, and
yes.
so on, and then. But Grant has the stock is rising again because there have been a lot of the Ron Chernow biography and another Ron White and Joan Waugh, whom I mentioned. There have been a lot of books about Grant, Brooks Simpson, and I think now the Grant that we're starting to see is, among biographers and scholars, is really the civil rights Grant, the Grant who put into
yes.
practice what Lincoln wanted, because Lincoln is killed. We have the Johnson administration, which is too bad.
Yes.
And then it's Grant who comes in and is the one who's trying to actually put into place now Reconstruction.
Well, not only that, but Grant, a lot of people don't know how hard Grant fought against the KKK,
yes.
how he tried to help
yep.
Native Americans.
Yep.
I mean, a lot of people don't know about that.
Yep. And there was also an early, he issued an order when they were in charge, when the Union took over Tennessee, which many people thought was anti-Semitic, and he got called out for it by a number of Jewish leaders, and he tried in his administration to make up for that too by appointing people to key things. So Grant really was trying, I think, to implement the democratic vision that Lincoln had imagined. So I think we're seeing that more now, and that the person who got taken advantage of in scandals and the gold and all that.
Yes.
That's still there, but it's not as seen. I don't think it's seen as significant.
I'm glad that's coming out.
Yeah, I think so. It really is.
You took the words right out of my mouth about, and this is another omission you touched upon, was the drinking. And so you mentioned this, that Twain wrote to Henry Ward Beecher and said, quote, I had told him to put the drunkenness in the memoirs and the repentance and the reform, trust the people. And he seems to have this revelation after hearing from Sherman. I think this is really fascinating. What do you think of this? I mean, do you think it detracts in any way from his memoirs because he doesn't touch upon it?
Not necessarily, but that's such a good thing to think about, because when we think about memoirs now, and I'm reading one right now, and I'll probably read another one after I finish this, and so on. We like confession, right? We
love the gossip.
We do. We like, and we particularly respond to people who mess up and own up to messing up, and thereby secure their narrative authority. That's a way of doing it, but I think that given who Grant was, given his position at the end of the war, and then during Reconstruction, I don't think he felt he could do that. He was curating a different kind of honesty. It wasn't that kind of honesty. It was another kind. I mean, he says some extraordinary things. He's very sharp about the great sin of the Mexican War, and that the Civil War was was retribution for that. You don't hear that a lot.
No.
Lincoln thought it. Henry David Thoreau thought it, but you don't hear a lot of people saying that kind of thing. So that's a kind of honesty.
Yes.
But he also says an extraordinary thing at Appomattox. He says he felt really bad when he's face to face with Lee. He felt really bad, but he couldn't imagine people fighting better for a worse cause, and that's a kind of honesty.
Yes.
You know, he wasn't trying to reconcile there. He also says towards the end of the memoirs, I think we're going to have to admit that the cause of the war was slavery, right? And that, you got people debating that up to the minute.
Today.
Up to the minute. And he goes ahead and says that. So he's capable of great honesty. I think he would have felt that personal disclosure was unseemly and was not becoming of who he was.
And you said he kind of learns that from Twain a little bit.
I think he learns that from Twain. Twain is there's stuff going on about Twain that you don't see in every book. Right.
So strategic a little bit.
Yeah, strategic.
Yeah. So I'm going to jump a little bit, and then hopefully we'll sort of end with Grant and Twain again before we do questions. But for those of you can see this, we have a book sitting in front of us, and this is Mark Twain's copy of McClellan's memoirs, so to speak. So unfortunately, there's not a lot of marginalia in it. I was hoping Twain really wrote in it quite a bit, but there's not. But this is his copy of it, which we did geek out a little bit.
You were very kind. I saw it in the vault, and I said, "Oh, can I hold it?" Yeah.
So Twain publishing company, Charles Webster, they also put out this book and published it. And McLellan is quite a divisive figure,
he is,
both then and even today. Can you talk a little bit about why that is? And also, I'm hoping you could touch on the fact, which I did not know this, that William Prime helped put together McClellan's memoirs after his death, and Mark Twain hated William Prime, and it really surprised me. So can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. So set the scene. This book is preceded by Grant, and this comes out the next year, and Grant has handed Julia Grant at the time a total of $500,000, which in today's dollars is between 10 and 11 million. It's not bad. It's not bad.
Yep.
For a writer. So Twain thinks he has the golden touch. He actually says that. So let's go on to the next soldier in the series. The series is called the Shoulder Strap series because it has the number of stars on the spine corresponding to the rank of the general. So the next installment we're going to do McClellan. Well, McClellan makes sense from what would you say, a business point of view, because he's very popular. He runs against Lincoln in 1864. He doesn't win, but as late as August of 1864, Lincoln is writing in the so-called blind memorandum that he's pretty sure his administration will lose. And the only reason that Lincoln doesn't lose is because Sherman takes Atlanta, and Sheridan takes the Shenandoah Valley. And that gives the war-weary, the Northern public, the desire to go on. But McClellan came very close, and he was very popular, especially among soldiers.
Yes.
Who loved him. And he was popular among Southerners because he ran on a peace platform. You elect me, we let the South go.
Yes.
And so Twain, you can see the wheels turning in Twain, and McClellan dies, so all of the negotiations for this book happened among Twain, Nellie McLellan, Ellen McLellan, McClellan's widow, and William Prime, who is
Can't believe it.
who is the William Grimes of Innocents Abroad.
Mm-hmm.
He's a Democrat. He's a newspaper editor. He was an educated person. He's connected with Princeton, and his son becomes faculty at Princeton. And I really see Twain here as going, I really don't like McClellan, but this book could sell. And
That sounds like my guy.
Yeah, no, and I think it was very
All about the money.
It was very calculated, and this book did turn a profit. Nowhere near Grant.
Yes.
Nowhere near Grant, but he was right. He did end up paying Nellie McLellan money, and I just think it's one of the things that this project is about is we rely on these books to give us a picture of the past. But these books are commercial products by people who wanted to make money. And I don't mean just the writers. I mean the publishers, the editors, the marketers, and everything. So what does that say about our picture of the past? Our picture of the past is at some level not just Civil War memory, but the Civil War memory market.
Right.
And I don't think that's not a comfortable thought, I think, for a lot of people, but it was business. And this book is testimony to that.
Yeah, Twain really hated Prime, and we didn't get to show you this, but we'll show you next time you
All right,
come.
good.
We have a book written by Prime in our collection, and Twain writes in the margins very sarcastic comments about Prime. So he says things like, what a braggart and liar the man is. Here he goes about astonishing everyone. Here he goes about thinking he's God. So, I mean, Twain really didn't like him. So I'm just surprised that
and the correspondence between them, I talk a little bit about this. You would think, Prime, I know, knew what Twain was saying about him, but his nose wasn't out of joint. He was ready to just, we're going to have business negotiations.
That's
now.
true.
How much can we get?
That's very true. Is there anything missing from the memoirs, either individually or collectively, that you wish was included or wish they had dove deeper in?
So individually or collectively, okay. Go back to Stephen Crane, or I'll do it a different way. Walt Whitman. Walt Whitman started writing for the New York Times in the 1860s, and he then became a visitor to many of the hospitals, and he wrote a book published in 1875 called Memoranda During the War. And he says in that book, the real war will never get in the books. The real war will never get in the books. And this is a often quoted phrase, and people argue about it. People now will say, oh, in fact, that's wrong, because with social historians and all we know about little people, unnamed people, and all that stuff we've collected, we actually do know a lot about the real war. But I think what Whitman was talking about is there is no way to communicate to a non-combatant the experience of combat. And we've gotten closer. I think Vietnam literature got us closer to that. I think some of the film and literature coming out of Iraq and Afghanistan have gotten us closer to that. But it's hard in these Civil War memoirs to just remember what really is going on and what words they were really saying to one another. Not, please give the general my compliments. They didn't need that many letters a lot of the time. And so I think a lot of the, part of me wishes they could be more graphic, just because that's where I come in the history of American writing. I've gotten used to the graphic being the badge of authenticity.
Yes.
That said, I also think it's possible to try to become a 19th century reader again and infer the graphic from the indirect and the hint. And I think that is possible.
Very interesting. But and you mentioned in your book too that just looking at Twain, he wasn't involved in the Civil War minus this
2 weeks,
small
something,
stint
yeah, right,
with the Marion Rangers
Yeah.
in Missouri, and then he heads out west for the Civil War. The Mississippi River is shut down except for military use, and I think he amongst many others want to know what it was like
Yeah.
to be there,
Yeah,
to
well,
experience
I mean,
it.
his best, it wasn't, Life on the Mississippi is his best Civil War memoir, because, and it's the chapter on Vicksburg and then the several chapters on New Orleans. You can see Twain, I mean, basically, again, to bring out somebody else, Hemingway said, and one can like this or hate this or just be indifferent to it, but Hemingway basically said, the war is the greatest topic for a writer, and if you haven't been in it, you've missed it. Now, you can take that with a big grain of Hemingway salt if you want, but there is a point to that. And I mean, we're seeing that now in the news right now, coming out of Ukraine. I mean, that's powerful, powerful, powerful writing and photography. And I think that Twain was making a serious bid to be the major American voice, and yet, oops, as soon as the war starts, except for maybe these 2 weeks, he heads out west, and it's actually even worse than that, because what was most needed on the Mississippi were qualified pilots. He could have chosen to go with the North, he could have chosen to go with the South, but both, Horace Bixby becomes his mentor, becomes a major pilot for the United States squadron. Will Bowen, his other person, goes for the Confederacy. Twain just goes, I'm out of here.
Right.
And people have made a lot about, was he trying to atone for some cowardice or something? Yeah, I don't know that I would have had any more courage than that. Conscientious objectors, that was a rare thing and not very well thought of. The Mennonites tried, Quakers tried, and so on. Lincoln wasn't having it a lot of the time. But I can't blame Twain for not wanting to go into battle. But I think that was the topic for so many people from 1861,
Yes.
right, till yesterday, or certainly till 1910 when Twain dies. And I think that there's a way in which he is trying to grab onto that.
Give something back.
Give something back, but also to realize the power of it.
Right.
And that when he looked at Grant's book, I think he realized, wow, this is a major work.
That segues perfect into my last question. So once again, those of you in the audience here and virtually, it is your time next. So get ready to have your questions asked. So to end our portion, and this is a great way, without Mark Twain, you said, the Civil War memory market would not have developed as it did. Besides the obvious financial benefit of publishing these memoirs, and we know that he had a very personal connection and friendship with Grant, are there any other reasons to you that he decided to take this on?
Just
talked about it,
the publishing.
Yes, the publishing.
Yeah, he starts his own company, Charles L. Webster, and his announced purpose is to publish himself, because he started the American Book Company. And he starts with a bang. He starts with Huckleberry Finn. That's not a bad way to start.
No.
And he probably wouldn't, if he hadn't run into Grant and Grant hadn't had downturn that he'd had, it's not clear that Twain would have made that move at all. So it is the success of Grant, I think, that gets him, that keeps him going. And it doesn't, it tails off after Grant. But I think what I mean by the influence of Twain on the Civil War memory market is through the Grant book. We have people like John Keegan, who's a British military historian, saying, if there's one book that sort of delivers this major panoramic look at the Civil War, it's Grant. Now, whether or not you buy that, Grant did that book then did establish a certain archetype for Civil War remembering. And what has been true from 1866, or let's say 1874, 1875 to the present, is that Civil War remembering in written form, or later in film form, is never very far from market forces. And it didn't have to be that way, right? Civil War memory could have developed in some other way, like religious memory or something like that. But it's that it became commercialized so quickly through Twain and others that I think that aspect of it has continued. And actually, it's just while we're kind of waiting for people to combust, that is a factor for people who work in the Civil War or any war memory. Is what are you doing? How are you making? Why are you making a career? Why am I making a career out of something so catastrophic? And somehow that disjunction seems to me to be at the heart of Twain, that he could recognize how awful it was, but man, he could see how lucrative it was too.
Yes.
And I think we've never gotten away from that.
Right. Oh, well, thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Great.
Yeah.
Happy to take. We're going to start with live audience questions. We have a question right
this
here.
This gentleman here.
This was great. Thank you so much. You're in English?
I am in English.
Professor doing history.
Yes.
So I've got an English question.
Okay, and I'll repeat this in case people
Yes,
can't hear it.
thank
Yeah.
And I was going to go after the alcohol a different way. So many great writers and thinkers have this alcohol. You mentioned Hemingway, Churchill later.
Faulkner.
Faulkner. I mean, the
Yeah.
list goes on.
Yeah.
Music and arts. It's a chicken and egg question. But does the alcohol? There's a mental illness or something that causes people to drink. But through the mental illness of genius, there's creativity that comes out of it. It's a chicken or egg. You have to be crazy to be a writer, or does being crazy make you a better writer?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Great question. I'll try to summarize it for the microphone, and if I get it wrong, you just correct me. But the gentleman's question basically is, it's as many people have noticed, the unholy alliance between and among creativity, alcohol, genius, perception, all these things. This comes up a lot, and the quickest version of this is my students will say, "Oh, this modern literature is so depressing. Can you only be a writer if you suffer?" or something like that. And I think it varies from writer to writer, but I could say that in Grant's case, the evidence we have, John Rawlins, his aide, is a big source here. The evidence we have is that Grant was actually, alcohol quickly poisoned him. That he was the kind of drinker, and I don't know. Well, imagine a friend, right? Imagine a friend who has a drink and then becomes more congenial, and then maybe has two and becomes the life of the party, and then maybe 3 and 4, and then ends up passing out. That wasn't Grant. Grant would have one or two drinks and change. He clearly had a very, very powerful effect on him. And his aide, John Rawlins, basically said, not only your destiny, but the destiny of the country is in your hands. You've really got to stop this. You cannot drink. So when Grant wrote, he was on cocaine and morphine, but that was considered medicine for somebody with advanced cancer at that point. But Grant was not a drinking writer. Hemingway he says this, I go to the desk or I go to the cafe and start writing at 7 or 8 in the morning, and by the time it's noon, I need to turn it off. And that was what alcohol was for him. It was release. Then you have people who are sort of working along with basically a C imaginary life, and then they have 2 drinks and they feel that they have an A imaginary life. So I think I think generalizations are hard. Another person who comes to mind is the poet Robert Lowell, who had problems with drinking and manic depression, and his friend was a poet, Elizabeth Bishop, and one of her students said, did Lowell have to be crazy to write? And her response is, he wrote in spite of being crazy. And that's also an angle too. So I'm not trying to evade, I just think it can't, one size won't fit all on that one. That people writing is so hard. Here we are in the place where upstairs Twain wrote 4,000 words a day. Writing is so hard that people have used just about every strategy.
Nixon wrote beautifully with God knows what in his...
Exactly, right. And so I think that that's just, Faulkner, Faulkner's editor, when Faulkner went in to visit his editor said, this passage from As I Lay Dying, what does this mean, Faulkner? And Faulkner looked at it and said, damned if I know. I was pretty corn liquor. I was pretty corned up when I wrote that part. I like reading Faulkner. I need to be cold sober when I do it though, because it's really hard. So I think it's just so many different ways. I mean, alcohol and mental illness are no different in writers from what they are in the population at large. They take many forms. It's just that they can become so intensified when all you do is sit in a room all day writing. That was a long answer. I hope it's okay.
Any other questions in the live audience?
Yes, sir.
Can you maybe touch on the role of the editor back then versus right now? Editors have a major part in the production of it. Was that true also in this era?
Great. The question is, the gentleman has asked, could we talk about the role of the editor in the production of these books? And right now editors have a lot of power or a lot of influence, but was that true in the 19th century? Fair? Yeah. Again, varied from case to case. Nobody was messing with Grant much at the end. Grant stuff was coming off the pen, off the page, and going right in to the press. And one of the things I looked at that moved me tremendously was at the Huntington. I looked at Grant's memoirs were sold by the method of subscription. So often former veterans would go door to door, knock on the door, and say, General Grant's writing his memoirs. Would you like to subscribe? We'll put you down, and then you'll get it. And what they would take with them would be a little sample. And it was usually a hardbound sample with a few pages. I was able to look at a sample that Charles Webster Twain, Webster Company, rushed into print and bound so Grant could hold it days before he died. And he even wrote in it some marginalia about Jefferson Davis in a particular story. And so in Grant's case, I mean, they're just waiting for, they're waiting for every page to come. Someone like McLellan, this book only exists because of an editor. Because McClellan's dead when this is put together. This really is more an anthology of McClellan's writings than anything else. McClellan got a memoir going only through the Peninsula Campaign. Went abroad, the manuscript burned. I'm sorry, he got a manuscript, he went abroad, it burned in a warehouse. He was rewriting it, he got through the Peninsula Campaign and died. So Prime, this is his work, basically. And what's really interesting about this, and we didn't talk about this, is Prime chose to include in McClellan's memoirs a lot of the correspondence between McClellan and his wife, in which McClellan is very vulnerable. And, people quarrel about McClellan a lot. I think that was a brilliant editorial decision. Some people said, well, you betrayed the general's confidence by publishing these private letters. Nellie McClellan was alive. She could have said something. But it gave people a side of McClellan they wouldn't see. So there's extremes. Grant, very little fiddling around by an editor. McClellan, completely an editorial project. So those would be either end. And you are right about editors now. This wasn't my title. I don't dislike it, but basically, you submit a book and the editor sits down with the marketing people and they tell you what they think the better title would be.
And you go with
And you go with that, right? Because the whatever it takes to write a book is not necessarily the same thing as it takes to market a book. Massive as they are. I'm waiting for the 11 million. That's coming. Yes, ma'am. I'm sorry.
Thank you so much for coming.
Yeah.
I'm so excited to hear you speak. I am humbly just trying to get into Grant's memoir, but I work here, and in our tours, we always talk about Grant every time. So a question that guests ask a lot who have read it, they want to know how much did Twain help? So just jumping off.
Yep.
Editing.
Yep. Yeah, the question is how much did Twain help in the writing of Grant's memoirs? Fair? Okay. This is like, did Bacon write Shakespeare's plays? No, Bacon did not write Shakespeare's plays. And no, Twain did not write Grant's memoirs. There's just no evidence that happened at all. In fact, there's other evidence. There's just a really moving letter where Twain, it's in the journals. It's in Twain's notebooks and journals. He goes to see Grant as Grant is dying, and he's just amazed because Grant has written, what's the figure that you use for Twain? How many words a day? 4,000, I think. 10,000 words, Grant. Sometimes he had to dictate because he couldn't write. But Grant was a machine. And he was, the thing about it is, here's the thing. Former generals of the Army had no pension. Former presidents had no pension. Grant had nothing. What he had, he gave to his son to invest, and a guy scammed them, and Grant lost everything. Grant was writing for the single thing he loved most in the world, which is his wife, Julia. He was devoted to her, and he knew that if he didn't finish this book, she had nothing. Now, he had no idea she was going to earn $500,000 in 1885 dollars or $11 million in 2022 dollars, but he was motivated. He was really motivated, and I think he also wanted to. He also had something to square with Lee, because already he knew by 1885, 1886 that popular memory was saying the great general was Lee. And Grant's very, very direct about, look, this guy had it easy. he's defending the inside lines. He can move people around. Every time I take any territory, I have to protect the railroad lines all the way back to Nashville or Washington or wherever it is. And so Twain wouldn't have done anything like that. He wouldn't have known enough to do that. So I think you can safely say with firmness and a smile, yeah, no, Twain did not write any of Grant's memoirs. That's just one of those myths out there. Rumors, yeah.
Well, sadly, we are out of time.
Oh, dear. Okay.
But I want to thank everyone, for those of you that came in person for joining us, for those of you that joined us virtually, thank you very much. I highly encourage everyone to get a copy of Stephen's book that we know now he did not name, called
It was close. It was close.
called The General Civil War. For those of you in person, we're going to be doing a book signing afterwards, so you can purchase the book from our museum shop. For those of you who are watching at home, the link will be in the chat, so you can order it online. And we also encourage you to buy Grant's memoirs along with Stephen's book, so that you can read the memoirs and then, get your opinion and more information on it. So thank you all very much for coming, and we hope to see you again soon. And thank you, Stephen.
Thank you, Mallory. Thank you very much. Everybody here, thank you.